The public imagination is held captive by the missile silo, the launch sequence, the final, kinetic event. This is a deliberate misdirection. The primary vector of systemic risk is not the sound of a launch, but the silence that follows. The silence when the global financial system goes dark. While the media focuses on Putin's public dismissals of war as hysteria, source number 4, the underlying strategic reality is one of terminal decline. Pro-Kremlin military analysts now publicly concede that the Russian Navy is incapable of defending its own oil tankers from interception. Source number 1. This is not weakness, it is strategic insolvency. For adversaries like Russia or Iran, whose economic collapse now threatens their national security, source number 2, the kinetic cost of a symmetric war is prohibitive. They cannot win. The rational response, therefore, is not to attack the Leviathan shield, but its central nervous system. The attack vectors are silent and deniable, the severing of undersea cables to induce a systemic liquidity crisis, the blinding of GPS and communication satellites to degrade command and control. The goal is not to destroy the West, but to paralyze it, to create a blind Leviathan. A superpower with overwhelming force, but no ability to see, navigate, or coordinate a response. It weaponizes our own complexity against us, triggering collapse from within. This is the mathematical endpoint of economic strangulation, and it's a protocol already in motion. To understand the motive, you must reclassify the Ukraine war not as a geopolitical gambit, but as a solvency crisis. CSIS analysis confirms the kinetic cost of the conflict has created a severe domestic liability for the Kremlin. The war is economically and politically unsustainable. This isn't a war of choice, it's a forced liquidation of national power. This strategic insolvency is now quantifiable. Pro-Kremlin military analysts have been forced to admit the Russian Navy cannot protect its own oil tankers from foreign interception. When your Navy cannot secure your primary economic artery, you're no longer a peer competitor, you are a distressed asset. This is the definition of conventional weakness. This blueprint is not unique to Russia. Reports on Iran show an identical vector, a profound economic crisis driven by sanctions and currency collapse is now classified as a direct threat to national security. The pattern is a mathematical certainty. Prolonged economic strangulation erodes symmetrical military capability. This forces a pivot. When conventional leverage is zero, states are forced to reprice their only remaining asset. Putin's public dismissal of war as hysteria just weeks after issuing nuclear threats is not confusion. It is strategic communication for two different audiences. For an insolvent state, the nuclear arsenal is no longer a weapon of last resort. It becomes the primary and only tool for negotiation. Asymmetry is not a bug. It's the inevitable feature of economic collapse. The math of kinetic conflict has been inverted. According to analysis from institutions like RUSI, the cost exchange is no longer symmetrical. A $5 million main battle tank can now be neutralized by a $500 FPV drone. This is not an anomaly. It is the new, brutal balance sheet of modern warfare. This is a mathematical certainty. This phenomenon has a clinical designation, the democratization of violence. It means the capability to liquidate high-value conventional assets is no longer monopolized by states with massive defense budgets. As economic pressure cripples adversaries, it creates a systemic solvency crisis. Pro-Kremlin analysts now publicly admit their navy cannot protect strategic assets. Reports from Homeland Security today confirm Iran's economic collapse is a direct threat to its national security. They can no longer afford to compete symmetrically. When a state is strategically insolvent, it is forced to adapt. This economic strangulation does not lead to capitulation. It leads to innovation in asymmetric leverage. They are compelled to bypass the conventional battlefield, where the kinetic cost-exchange ratio guarantees their defeat. The cheap drone is the tactical symptom. The strategic consequence is the reclassification of their ultimate weapon. The nuclear arsenal shifts from a tool of last resort to their only viable, and therefore rational, lever of power. The primary vector for this new conflict doctrine will not be the Fulda Gap or the Taiwan Strait. It will be the global gray zones, regions of political instability and porous logistics chains. Nations like South Africa, now issuing public warnings about destabilization, are not the cause. They are designated as proxy laboratories. These are arenas where the kinetic cost of action is low and attribution is deniable. This is not a failure of regional governance. It is the successful selection of a new battlefield. For a state facing a strategic solvency crisis, direct confrontation is suicide. Asymmetric action in a gray zone is a sound investment. According to analyses from RUSI, the goal is to operate below the threshold that triggers a systemic Western military response. It is a blueprint for creating maximum economic friction with minimal military liability. The inability of the Russian Navy to protect its own tankers, as admitted by its own analysts, is not a weakness. It is the strategic justification for shifting to non-naval, asymmetric asset denial. The economic strangulation of states like Iran, documented by Homeland Security today as a national security threat, forces a doctrinal pivot. When your currency collapses and your ships are seized, conventional deterrence becomes a mathematical impossibility. The rational response is to shift the conflict to a domain where your adversary's systemic complexity is a liability. You don't sink a carrier. You introduce a novel contaminant into a Western port via a third-party proxy, creating billions in economic damage for the cost of a plane ticket and a burner phone. Therefore, the public dismissal of war by leaders like Putin as hysteria is technically correct. He is not planning a symmetrical war. The system is being primed for an asymmetric one. These proxy laboratories are where new protocols of economic warfare are beta tested. The next phase is not a declaration of war. It is the quiet weaponization of the global logistics network, staged from the very zones the West has deemed peripheral. The Launch on Warning protocol is not an act of aggression. It is a system of automated response. As detailed by analysts at CSIS, it is a defensive mechanism hardwired to counter a decapitation strike. The logic is simple. If early warning systems detect a massive inbound missile launch, the protocol mandates an immediate, full-scale retaliatory launch. Before, the incoming warheads can destroy the nation's own silos and command centers. It is a hair trigger designed to guarantee mutual destruction, neutralizing the advantage of a first strike. This doctrine's risk profile becomes an accelerant when a state's conventional power enters a solvency crisis. Pro-Kremlin military analysts now openly admit Russia's navy cannot protect its own tankers from interception. This is not a tactical problem. It is a systemic failure of kinetic leverage. As sanctions and economic pressures erode the national security apparatus of adversaries like Russia and Iran, their conventional forces become a depreciating asset. This forces a strategic recalculation. The nuclear arsenal shifts from a tool of last resort to the only viable instrument of power. This brings us to the fog of digital war. The critical vulnerability in the Launch on Warning protocol is the integrity of the warning itself. A peer-level cyber attack does not need to physically damage a silo. It only needs to blind the radar or, more potently, create a credible phantom launch on the command screens. By manipulating sensor data an adversary can simulate a full-scale first strike, triggering the protocol without ever launching a physical weapon. The commander on duty is now faced with a zero-sum choice. According to RUSI analysis, the protocol is designed to eliminate human hesitation. Is the alert a digital ghost, a catastrophic system failure? Or is it a genuine attack, camouflaged by the possibility of a cyber attack? To wait for confirmation is to risk the total annihilation of their nation's ability to retaliate. The doctrine, therefore, makes launching the only rational response. Economic strangulation creates the desperation. The fog of digital war provides the trigger. The mathematical certainty is this: the West's economic pressure campaign is a systemic success. It is also a strategic accelerant for asymmetric warfare. Forcing a peer competitor into a state of strategic insolvency, where their conventional military becomes a liability, does not eliminate the threat. It transforms it. Pro-Kremlin analysts now openly admit the Russian Navy cannot protect its own tankers. CSIS reports confirm Iran's economic collapse threatens its core national security. Their capacity for symmetric, kinetic competition is eroding. When a state's primary levers of power are neutralized, it does not capitulate. It recalibrates. The nuclear arsenal shifts from a weapon of last resort to the only credible leverage remaining. The operational doctrine moves from deterrence to coercion. This necessitates a test, a non-fatal demonstration of capability and will, designed for plausible deniability. This is not an act of war. It is a calibration shot. Within 12 months, anticipate a coordinated, attribution impossible cyber event targeting the supervisory control and data acquisition, SCADA, systems of a Tier 1 Western liquefied natural gas, LNG, export terminal. The objective is not explosion, but paralysis. A 72 to 96-hour shutdown blamed on cascading system failure or a rogue hacktivist group. The kinetic cost is zero. The economic signal that the West's energy independence is vulnerable to non-attributable disruption is irrefutable. The message will be received not by the public, but by the financial institutions underwriting the sanctions.